tens of thousands of Viking warriors, all heading straight for Paris. The city should have been crushed in days, but instead, what followed was 11 months of fire, hunger, and desperation. One of the strangest survival stories in medieval history. Stay with me, because this siege didn't end the way anyone expected. Late November 885. Out of the mist, the Vikings arrive. Hundreds of longships pushing up the Seine, dragon heads on every prow. Chroniclers claim 700 ships and 30,000 men, but modern historians say it was closer to 6,000 or 7,000. But if you were standing on those walls, staring at the river packed end to end with Vikings, numbers didn't matter. It looked like the world was ending. Except these Vikings weren't playing that game. They weren't here for a quick score. They had siege engines, camps, tents, trenches, all the tools of a proper military operation. They landed near the Ile de la Cité bridges, waving demands for tribute. Count Odo, the city's big-shot defender, basically says, "Nope, pay nothing, let's see what you do." Now it's on. This is no hit and run. The Vikings start hammering the city. Mangonels lobbing boulders, ballistae snapping off bolts, miners digging like rats under the walls. The Parisians fought back with tricks just as vicious. Pitch, wax, and even wasp nests hurled down on helmets. Chroniclers may have exaggerated, but the image stuck. Defenders turning beehives into medieval grenades. Crossing the Seine wasn't simple either. Rumors spread that Count Odo had ordered hidden stakes driven into the mud beneath the water, ready to gut any Viking boat that veered too close. The two bridges, Petit Pont, wooden and fragile, and Grand Pont, stone and sturdy, were more than crossings. They were choke points sharpened into traps. Take one, and the city was yours. Fail, and the river itself turned executioner. By December, the siege is in full swing. Expectations of easy plunder evaporate. The Franks learn quickly. This isn't just a raid, it's a test of endurance, strategy, and stubbornness. But why Paris? Why now? Because the empire of Charlemagne was collapsing. The Carolingian kings were weak, and Paris sat right on the Seine, the main highway through Francia. Whoever controlled its bridges controlled trade, tribute, and the richest lands in the kingdom. To the Vikings, this wasn't just another raid. It was a chance to break the Franks where it hurt most. By the time the Vikings pushed up the Seine, Paris looked like a tiny cork bobbing in a storm. Count Odo had maybe 200 men-at-arms. That's right, 200 humans staring down what Abbo Cernouus calls tens of thousands of Viking raiders. Modern historians think Abbo exaggerated, but even cutting it in half, the Franks were laughably outnumbered. Hundreds against a fleet that might have numbered 30,000 men, all hungry for loot, blood, and conquest. And these 200 weren't just standing on some open field, they were holding the island heart of Paris, Ile de la Cité, a place that looked more like a stone ship anchored in the Seine. Some chroniclers even whispered that priests carried relics of saints to the walls, believing holy bones and splinters of the true cross would terrify the pagan Norsemen. Odo and Bishop Gozlin didn't just fortify the bridges, they turned the entire island into a shrine of defiance. The Vikings attacked immediately. Ballistae fired, mangonels slammed rocks, catapults hurled death. The Parisians poured hot wax, boiling pitch, reinforced walls overnight, and yes, even Bishop Gozlin jumped in with bow and axe like a full-on action hero. Day 2, Vikings try mining the walls, battering rams swing, nothing gives. Bridges burn, defenders divert fire ships to stone foundations so the wood survives. Every day, the tiny garrison turned back a sea of killers. Hundreds of ships at the gates, towers blazing, death all around, and Paris still stood. But sieges aren't just about walls. They're about patience, nerves, and who snaps first. When attrition bites, who will crack first? Winter turned the siege into a slow grind. The Vikings didn't pack up and leave, they doubled down. They hauled mangonels and catapults to the banks, hurling stones and fire at the walls. At one point, they literally ripped apart a church's belfry, strapped wheels to it, and shoved it toward the Parisian defenses like a homemade tank. Imagine the sound of that creaking tower rolling forward. Arrow slits cut into it so their archers could rain death while the ram pounded below. But Odo's defenders weren't passive. Buckets of boiling pitch and wax poured from the battlements. Arrows rained back, and every time a wall cracked, masons worked through the night to rebuild it stronger. It was exhaustion versus stubbornness. Then, February dealt a blow. The Seine's currents, jammed with debris and swollen with winter floods, tore out the Petit Pont, the wooden bridge. That collapse stranded the northeast tower with maybe a dozen defenders inside. The Vikings swarmed it, expecting surrender, but the garrison held out, fighting to the last man until the tower burned around them. Even then, Paris wouldn't break. Frustrated, the Vikings tried to literally change the river itself, dumping branches, animal carcasses, even earth into the Seine to make a crossing. It barely worked, and food was running thin. Raiders started peeling off upriver, hitting Le Mans, Chartres, Burgundy, just to stay alive. Inside Paris, disease crept in. Outside, Viking morale sagged. Everyone was tired, everyone was hungry, and still the walls stood. Just as both sides were ready to collapse, Charles the Fat finally marched north. And his decision? It wasn't swords that saved Paris, it was silver. By October 886, help finally arrived, or so everyone thought. Emperor Charles the Fat marched north with his army. People expected him to smash the Viking camp and lift the siege in a blaze of glory. Instead, he did the opposite. He set up camp on Montmartre Hill in full view of the starving city, and then stalled. No charges, no assaults, no bold rescue. He watched. Meanwhile, the Viking army wasn't the same force that had thundered up the Seine nearly a year earlier. Under leaders Sigfred and Sinric, they'd already lost men to disease, desertion, and raids up the river. Months of fighting and hunger had worn them thin, yet they still clung to the walls of Paris, waiting for a break. That's when Charles made his move. Not with swords, but with silver, 700 pounds of it. Think about that, nearly 260 kilos of coin, enough to bankroll a small county or pay hundreds of men for years. He offered it on one condition. The Vikings had to leave Paris alone and take their fury elsewhere. The Norsemen agreed. They pulled back from the bridges, packed up their camps, and drifted down to Burgundy to plunder fresh land. For Paris, it meant survival. For Charles, it meant disgrace. The defenders had endured 11 months of hell, only for their emperor to buy off the enemy instead of crushing them. And that decision didn't just end the siege, it turned the empire against its own king. Paris had survived the unthinkable. 11 months of fire, hunger, and blood, and the walls still stood. But survival came with a bitter aftertaste. The emperor, the man supposed to protect them, hadn't swung a sword. Word spread that he feasted in his tent while Paris starved, waiting for the Vikings to tire themselves out. Instead, he quietly opened his treasury. A fortune vanished in the night, and all the defenders saw was the enemy sailing away heavier with silver than with loot. To the nobles who had bled for their lands, this wasn't a strategy. It was betrayal. Inside Paris, though, one man's star blazed brighter than ever: Count Odo. This was the guy who rode through Viking fire to bring food into the city when people were starving. The guy who rallied his men when towers cracked. Ordinary Parisians and powerful nobles alike began whispering the same thing. This is the man who should lead us, not Charles. And Charles the Fat? His crown slipped right off his head. Nobles abandoned him. His authority evaporated. In February 888, just months after the siege, Odo was crowned King of West Francia at Compiègne. For the first time, the Carolingian dynasty, the line of Charlemagne himself, was shoved aside. Odo's kingship cracked open the door for the Robertian line, ancestors of the mighty Capetians who would rule France for centuries. The siege hadn't just tested walls, it had rewritten the politics of an empire. A king fell because he chose silver over swords. A count rose because he chose courage over compromise. But this story didn't stop at crowns. Behind the clash of axes and the stink of burning pitch, one quiet figure was watching. Abocernus, a monk inside the city, turned the siege into legend. He exaggerated everything. 700 ships, tens of thousands of men. But his story made Paris look like David against Goliath. It wasn't just history, it was marketing. Abbo's words turned chaos into a national myth. His poem echoed for centuries. Kings quoted it, preachers preached it, and generations grew up believing Paris had stood alone, protected not by soldiers, but by faith itself. What he left out is just as telling. Charles the Fat's payoff to the Vikings, downplayed. The betrayal, muted. The political cracks, smoothed over. His omissions show exactly what story needed to be sold, that Paris stood unbroken, that its defenders were righteous, and that weakness didn't live inside its walls. Abbo's pen turned a survival story into legend, but legends rewrite politics. Charles's payout looked like a clever fix at first, but in the eyes of nobles, it was treason wrapped in silver. Some even claimed the coins used were melted down church treasures. Chalices and crosses turned into bribes for pagans. Whether true or not, the story spread like wildfire, poisoning his reputation. To nobles who'd fought through months of blood, mud, and famine, this wasn't a strategy. It was humiliating. Imagine standing on the walls, watching your friends die, only to see your emperor wave a silver sack at the killers and tell them, "Off you go." The fallout was brutal. By 887, Charles was tossed out, literally deposed by his own nobles. That ended the once mighty Carolingian dynasty's grip on West Francia. The betrayal opened the door for Odo of Paris, the count who'd held those walls with barely 200 men. In 888, he was elected king, the first time a non-Carolingian wore the crown. That alone rewired French politics. The Carolingian divine right gave way to leaders chosen because they fought, not because of bloodline. And the Vikings? They didn't vanish with the silver. Sigfred, Sinric, and later Rollo kept prowling the rivers. Rollo's deal in 911 gave him Rouen, the seed of Normandy. One payoff snowballed into a Viking duchy inside Francia, and from that duchy would come William the Conqueror, who flipped all of Europe upside down in 1066. The silver didn't just end the siege, it shattered a dynasty and created a new kind of kingdom, one where loyalty went to warriors, not bloodlines. Paris didn't just survive the siege, it carved a new identity out of the wreckage. Those cracked towers and half-burned bridges became scars of pride, proof that a city of barely a few hundred fighters had stood toe-to-toe with 6,000 hardened Norsemen. Archaeologists later found the repairs, walls thickened by nearly 2 meters of stone, new towers thrown up to cover weak spots on the Seine. The city learned, if you can outlast Vikings once, you prepare to outlast them again. But the most shocking twist? The Vikings didn't disappear into the fog. They evolved. Within a generation, the same raiders were dining at Frankish tables. Rollo, once a terror on the Seine, now wore a duke's cloak. The deal that gave him Rouen didn't just create Normandy, it blurred the line between Viking and Frank. Norse chiefs baptized their sons, married Frankish noblewomen, and yet kept their edge. Chroniclers wrote nervously that the wolf had learned to wear sheep's wool. The wild raiders who once burned villages were suddenly landowners, marrying Frankish women, baptizing children, and blending Norse toughness with Frankish politics. By the mid-10th century, their descendants weren't just tolerated, they were indispensable. Knights, counts, dukes, and one day, conquerors of England. For Paris, the siege left more than rubble. It planted a seed of urban unity. Odo's defense became legendary, fueling an early sense of civic pride. Chroniclers like Regino of Prum marveled that an island fortress held when kingdoms faltered. That pride didn't die. It echoed in French politics, where cities would later push back against kings just as boldly as they once did against Vikings. And yet, the siege revealed something darker. Kingdoms could collapse under weak leadership. Silver could replace swords, and enemies could turn into allies. The raid became Normandy, and Normandy went on to reshape all of Europe. The siege ended, but the real fight was just beginning, because the enemy waiting for the Vikings next wasn't human. It was the freezing nights of winter. Trust me, you'll want to see this one next, so click right here and find out why winter was the Vikings' deadliest enemy.